Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a closer look at essential tremor. It's something that really impacts a lot of people. You might have even noticed a slight tremor in your own hands sometimes. I mean, we all do. But what we're going to explore today is when those subtle shakes become more obvious, and what that could mean for you. This deep dive is all about helping you understand visible tremors.
Yeah, absolutely. We've compiled quite a bit of information, really, to break down essential tremor, or ET. It's a neurological condition. And basically, it's marked by this involuntary shaking. It's interesting because everyone actually experiences these tiny tremors. I mean, they're usually too small to even notice. But for more than 60 million people all over the world, these tremors are visible. And they can really have an impact on everyday life. It's actually the most prevalent kind of movement disorder that we're aware of.
60 million people. That's a really widespread condition. So let's get right to it. What exactly is essential tremor?
Well, essential tremor is basically this uncontrollable shaking. And it can actually affect different parts of the body, but it shows up most often in the hands. And I think it's really important for people to understand that it's a progressive condition. So that means it kind of gradually gets worse over time. And while it's diagnosed more often in people over 65, it can actually show up at any age. There are even some experts who differentiate between essential tremor that starts earlier in life and what they call age-related tremor, which comes on later.
So it's not just one experience. The age of onset seems to actually play a role in how it's viewed. So what about the symptoms? What should people be watching for? Because I imagine it's probably not exactly the same for everyone.
You're exactly right. The symptoms can really vary from person to person, and the severity can range from, very mild, barely noticeable to, pretty significant. As we talked about, the most common symptom is this kind of fine rhythmic shaking in the hands. So think about things that you do that require like precise movements, things like writing or eating, or even just buttoning your shirt. You can see how even a little tremor can make those things more challenging. But it's not just the hands. The shaking can also affect the head. Sometimes it's like a yes, yes or no, no motion. And the voice, too. Someone's voice might sound shaky. And sometimes the legs or other parts of the body as well. And this shaping, it has this repetitive, oscillating quality to it. And as you said, it can be up and down or side to side.
When you talk about shaking, Parkinson's disease is one of the first things that pops into my head. So what are the main differences between essential tremor and Parkinson's disease?
That's a really important question to clarify. So both conditions do involve tremors, but they differ in when those tremors are most obvious. So with essential tremor, the shaking in the hands usually happens when you're actually using your hands. It's what's called an action tremor. You'll notice it more when you're actively trying to do something, not so much when your hands are just relaxed. Parkinson's tremors, though, are actually most noticeable when the hands are at rest. So if your hands are just resting in your lap or by your side, that's when those tremors are most apparent.
So that difference in when the tremor happens seems like a key way to tell them apart. What about the speed or the intensity of the shaking itself?
Well, it's really interesting because the frequency of the tremor, meaning how rapidly it shakes, might actually decrease as someone gets older. But the intensity, which is how wide the shaking motion is, can increase over time. And that's often what makes the biggest difference in someone's ability to handle daily tasks. And there are certain things that can trigger or worsen essential tremor. So strong emotions, stress, fever, physical exhaustion, and even low blood sugar can make those tremors more noticeable. And while ET can start at any age, it's most often noticed around, say, adolescence or middle age, so generally between 40 and 50.
And I remember reading something about alcohol and how it affects essential tremor.
Yeah, that's right. It's been observed that small amounts of alcohol can sometimes temporarily lessen the severity of essential tremor. But honestly, the exact reason for this, we don't fully understand it. But it's definitely not recommended as a treatment. I mean, there are other health risks associated with alcohol use.
Right. Definitely not a long-term strategy there. What about connections with other health conditions? Is there a link between essential tremor and Parkinson's in terms of risk?
Generally, essential tremor isn't directly linked to other health problems, although there are some people with ET who might develop other neurological signs, things like balance problems or gait issues. Parkinson's, on the other hand, is often associated with a wider range of symptoms. So, things like stooped posture, slower movements, and that kind of shuffling walk. And in terms of the body parts that are affected, ET primarily involves the hands, the head, and the voice. While Parkinson's tremors often start in the hands, but they can spread more broadly, so it could affect like the legs, the jaw, and other areas. There is some research going on right now that suggests that people who develop essential tremor later in life might have a slightly higher risk of also developing Parkinson's. But the exact nature of that connection is still being investigated.
So while they're distinct, there may be some overlap, especially as the brain ages. So let's move on to the causes of essential tremor. Is there a specific cause that's been identified?
Well, in about half of all cases, essential tremor, which is sometimes called familial or hereditary tremor, seems to run in families. And in these instances, we believe it's caused by a combination of genetic factors, although the specific genes that are responsible, we haven't quite pinpointed them yet. Researchers are working hard to figure out those genetic links. And it's interesting because it often follows what we call an autosomal dominant inheritance pattern. So what that means is that if one parent carries the gene for essential tremor, there's a 50% chance that each of their children will also inherit it and could potentially develop the condition. And, familial tremor usually becomes noticeable in early middle age, but it can actually appear at any point in life.
So for a lot of people, it's a matter of genetics. But what about those who don't have a family history? What are some other factors that might increase their risk of developing essential tremor?
Well, the chances of developing essential tremors do go up quite a bit as we get older, and that's even for people without a family history of the condition. And beyond just age and genetics, there are some potential associations that researchers have noticed, although, it's really important to remember that these aren't necessarily direct causes. But some of these associations include things like using certain medications or exposure to toxins like lead and mercury. Hyperthyroidism, which is basically an overactive thyroid gland, has also been linked to smoking in some studies. And then there's dystonia, which is a neurological disorder that causes involuntary muscle contractions. And as we talked about earlier, some specialists believe that there might be a slightly increased risk of developing other neurological conditions, like Parkinson's disease and even hearing loss. And this seems to be especially true if the essential tremor develops later in life, after the age of 65. So these are areas where research is still ongoing, and we're still learning about those exact relationships.
So it sounds like it's a really complex picture, possibly with multiple things contributing. What about things that make the tremors worse for someone who's already been diagnosed with essential tremor? We've already mentioned a few.
Yeah, there are definitely several things that can aggravate essential tremor symptoms. Fatigue, so being tired, either physically or mentally, can often make the tremors more intense. Similarly, anxiety and stress, those are big triggers for a lot of people. And even lifestyle factors play a role too. So excessive caffeine and smoking have been linked to making the tremors worse. Even environmental factors like being exposed to really hot or cold temperatures can sometimes make the shaking more noticeable.
So being mindful of those aggravating factors could be an important part of managing the condition. Now, if someone thinks they might have essential tremor, how do they get diagnosed? Are there any specific tests for it?
It's interesting because there's not one definitive test, like a blood test or brain scan, that can diagnose essential tremor, for sure. The diagnosis is really based on a comprehensive physical exam and a review of your symptoms and, of course, your medical history. And because the symptoms of essential tremor can be similar to other conditions, especially Parkinson's disease, sometimes it can be a little tricky to make a clear distinction.
So what will the doctor be focusing on during that evaluation?
Well, a doctor will typically start by taking a detailed history. So they'll ask about your symptoms, when they started, what makes them better or worse if you have any family history of tremor, and they'll also want to know about your overall health and any medications you're taking. Then they'll do a physical exam, which would include checking things like your reflexes, muscle strength, your gait, your posture, and your coordination. They might also run some tests to rule out other medical conditions that could be causing those tremors. And often they'll also assess your ability to feel certain sensations.
And are there any specific tasks or activities that doctors use to directly observe the tremor?
Yeah, absolutely. There are several common tasks that doctors use to see the characteristics of your tremor. They might ask you to do things like, pouring water from one cup to another and then drinking from it, or touching your index finger to your nose. Or they might ask you to write a sentence or draw a spiral or a series of connected circles. By observing your hands and other body parts during those activities, it can give them valuable clues to help with the diagnosis.
So it really comes down to careful observation and ruling out other things. So let's talk about treatment options for essential tremor. What kind of treatments are there?
Well, the good news is that there are a number of different ways to manage essential tremor. This includes medications, lifestyle changes, assistive devices that can help with daily activities, and in more severe cases, surgical interventions might be an option. Often, medications like beta blockers and anticonvulsants are prescribed to help reduce the severity of the tremors. And making lifestyle changes like avoiding triggers, such as stress, excessive caffeine, and alcohol, can also be really helpful in managing those symptoms.
Let's dig a little deeper into the medications. You mentioned beta blockers and anticonvulsants. How do those work to reduce the tremors?
Beta blockers, like propranolol, work by blocking the effects of certain neurotransmitters in the body, and that can help reduce tremors. They've been found to be effective in reducing tremor severity for about half of individuals with essential tremor, although they tend to be less effective for tremors that affect the head and voice. But it's important to mention that beta blockers aren't right for everyone, especially people with certain medical conditions like asthma, congestive heart failure, or problems with blood flow. And they also need to be used carefully in folks with insulin-dependent diabetes. Some potential side effects can include fatigue, exercise intolerance, low blood pressure or heart rate. It could worsen depression, and in some cases, it can cause erectile dysfunction. But there are other beta blockers like metopol and timolol that may have fewer side effects for some individuals.
What about anticonvulsant medications?
So anticonvulsants like primidone, those work by affecting the activity of certain receptors in the brain. And this can help to calm those overactive nerve signals that are contributing to the tremors. Now, some people who start taking primidone might experience what we call an initial dose phenomenon, which can cause temporary symptoms like unsteadiness, dizziness, and nausea. But these usually go away as the body gets used to the medication. A more common side effect in the long term can be sedation or drowsiness, but this can often be minimized by starting with a low dose and gradually increasing it under the guidance of a doctor.
So medications can be helpful, but it sounds like there can be side effects, and they might not work for everyone. What about those lifestyle changes you talked about?
Right. Well, since certain situations can make tremors worse, making changes to your daily routines can really be beneficial. This can include just being more mindful of and limiting your intake of alcohol and caffeine,
Hmm.
and actively trying to minimize stressful situations whenever possible, and incorporating some relaxation techniques like yoga or deep breathing exercises or even mindfulness meditation can be helpful in managing tremor symptoms. It's also a really good idea to chat with your doctor about all the medications you're currently taking because, some drugs can actually worsen tremors as a side effect.
And when medications and lifestyle changes aren't quite enough to provide relief, are there other options? You mentioned surgical interventions.
Yeah, so in some more severe cases of essential tremor, when other treatments haven't been effective enough, surgical interventions might be considered. One option is deep brain stimulation, or DBS. And this involves surgically implanting these thin electrodes into specific parts of the brain. These electrodes then send out electrical signals that can help regulate brain activity and reduce tremors. Another surgical procedure is called a thalamotomy, and that involves making a small, very targeted lesion in the thalamus, which is the area of the brain that's involved in motor control. This lesion can actually disrupt the brain signals that are causing the tremor. And typically, a thalamotomy is performed on only one side of the brain to help reduce tremors on the opposite side of the body, because doing it on both sides carries a higher risk of potential complications. But it's really important to emphasize that surgery is generally considered a last resort treatment for essential tremor.
It sounds like managing essential tremor is about finding the right combination of strategies. What works for one person might not work for another, and it depends on the severity of their symptoms, too.
You got it. It's really important to understand that while there isn't a cure for essential tremor right now, the symptoms can be effectively managed for a lot of people, which allows them to maintain a good quality of life. The key is to have an open and ongoing dialogue with your healthcare provider to come up with a personalized treatment plan that addresses your specific symptoms and how those symptoms are impacting your daily life. Because, with the right care and the right management strategies, people with essential tremor can definitely continue to lead productive and fulfilling lives.
That's a really encouraging message. So, to sum it up, essential tremor is a common neurological condition that's mainly characterized by shaking, especially in the hands. It's progressive, meaning it can get worse over time, and it can affect people of any age, although it's more often diagnosed in older adults. And while genetics are a big factor in a lot of cases, there are also other potential risk factors, and certain things can trigger those tremors or make them worse. Diagnosis is usually based on a thorough clinical evaluation. And the good news is that there are several management options available, including medication, lifestyle changes, and in some cases, surgery. And all of these are aimed at helping you live well with the condition.
Absolutely. And it's so important for you, the listener, to remember that your experience with essential tremor is unique to you. And finding the best way to manage it is something you do together, you and your healthcare team.
That's a great point. And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. Think about how stress might be affecting your own tremor symptoms. Have you noticed any patterns? And what relaxation techniques might be helpful for you to explore further in managing those connections?
That's a really insightful question to ponder. And if you're interested in finding additional resources and maybe connecting with a community, there's a really great online platform available. You can find more info and connect with others at this Discord link, https://discord.ggf5en5zqfa3.
And all of the great information that we've talked about in this deep dive comes from the amazing resources over at Tremor.Today. Thanks for joining us for this important discussion.